Hey guys! Part 5 of What If Naruto was in Mass Effect. Hit like and subscribe if you like this one, and also please check the author in the description. Let's start.
We are pain, that's all. We are God.
Chapter 20, Bring Down the Sky Part 1. Normandy Command Deck, 7:42 May 3, 2184, 23 hours after Batarian assault. Jane Shepard, Council Spectre, and Hero of Elysium. Well, this explains why we weren't able to contact the Asgardian frigate pack about our concerns. Looking at the sensor readings of at least one destroyed Alliance frigate, and 3 smaller vessels that were probably civilian in origin, Jane felt that XO Presley's comments were a little understated. Given the potential threats facing them, and the communications blackout from the Asgard system after they had arrived into the Exodus cluster, the Normandy had activated its stealth systems and left the Ontario at the gateway. The Quarian crew had made some excellent progress towards making the Ontario a support-type vessel, with enhanced communications, radar and cyber warfare equipment seemingly conjured up from scrap materials the away teams salvaged. Yet, until it could be fitted with shielding and some defensive weapons, there was no way Jane would allow the ship into an active war zone. So, the Mako was back aboard the Normandy, along with the entirety of their marine detachment, while AI and the majority of the stored Batarian weapons were on the Ontario until the all-clear was given. No point in risking casualties when they weren't needed. Registering at least 3 frigate-level ships at the edge of our passive sensor range, Commander, though they are all using planetary bodies as cover. Highly doubt those ships are friendly. Probably the ones who took out the SSV Jackal here. Joker chimed in, his usual joking tone replaced by a steely edge as he navigated the Normandy around the wreckage. We will leave them for the Third Fleet when it arrives, though if the Batarians have gone this far, then there is probably less time than we anticipated. The threat of such a vital colony being annihilated was something that Jane couldn't keep to herself, even if she agreed with Naruto about his intent to keep the theory from the Council. Captain Anderson had been informed, and had been coordinating an urgent, but unrelated military exercise for the 3rd and 5th Fleet in the nearest cluster when they left the Citadel. The 3rd Fleet wouldn't be partaking in the exercise, however, and were probably making their way to the Exodus cluster as fast as they could, whilst the 5th Fleet were preparing for any offensive maneuvers from the hegemony itself. Admiral Singh, the 3rd Fleet's commander, would probably be on the first ship to come storming into the Asgard cluster. A former N5 operative turned ship captain, before the meteoric rise to admiral that had broken pretty much every record around, Nitesh Singh was one of the few members of Alliance brass that Jane actually had the time of day for. I don't think time is the primary concern here, Commander. Presley's voice was tight as he transferred something to the Galaxy View, the readings taking several moments to mesh with the previous data he had sent before flaring into life on her screen. Looking down from her command position, Jane's eyes widened as she saw what Presley was referring to. A dreadnought. Thought. As they were only using passive sensors, as active sensors would require them to drop their cloaking, it took Presley several more seconds before he shook his head negatively. The only known Batarian dreadnought, the Allurum prototype, is actually about 25% bigger than this thing we are reading on our sensors. It could be some kind of grand cruiser that the Batarians created after Elysium, but there have been no reports of any ship like this in any of the Alliance's anti-pirating campaigns. Which meant that either these Batarian pirates had retrofitted a cruiser in a black market shipyard, or that hegemony had been successful in keeping some of their fleet's strength secret even from Alliance intelligence. We will be able to get better readings as we get closer, Commander, but I am reading at least 4 frigates and several smaller craft as well as that thing, in orbit over Terra Nova. Even if we deal with the asteroid, that number of ships would be able to wipe the colony off the map before the 3rd Fleet can reach us. And the Normandy couldn't hope to deal with the cruiser by itself, let alone backed up by other frigates, no matter its prototype arsenal and Joker's flying skills. How long do we have until the asteroid reaches a point of no return? Presley looked at his readouts for a moment, before looking up and shrugging slightly. Hard to say, Commander. I am not a specialist in sensors and this kind of calculation. But given the Batarian ships heading to the surface of Terra Nova and the speed of the asteroid, At least 12 hours. Batarian ships heading to the surface. Jane could work out the specifics of that later. Instead, she activated the ship's PA system. All Spectre team members to the bridge. Get your gear ready, this one is going to be messy. Jane highly doubted any of them weren't already suited up and ready to go. They knew what they had been getting into with this mission, but it was always good to be sure. Deactivating the PA, Jane moved from the command post towards the Normandy's helm. She needed Joker to get them close enough for detailed readings on that unknown ship. Normandy Command Deck, 9:15 May 3, 2184. Erdnot Rex, Krogan Warlord. As I told you, Shepard, it's a slaver ship. The last 2 hours had been rather tense for all those aboard, well, everyone but Rex, of course. He had been spoiling for a good fight since Naruto had beaten the shit out of him in that spar, and his first comment after reaching the command deck had not helped other people's mood. What my bonded is trying to say, as he forgets the rest of you aren't centuries old, and forgetting things like birthdays, anniversaries, and anything else that doesn't involve a fight, is ships like that were much more common about 200 years ago. Can't remember what the official Batarian name for them is, but they are called harbingers by those that lived in the Terminus system at the time. As his bonded, and Rex still had to resist the chuckle that came up every time it was mentioned around those that didn't know, clarified his statement. He merely gestured towards the now more detailed ship on the Normandy's main viewing display. Ended up boarding a couple of these in my time, either to rescue a target group or just because they interrupted my drinking. Rex noticed that most of the Spectre's team didn't even seem surprised at the idea he would get involved in boarding a cruiser ship over a spilled drink, and he wasn't sure he liked having that kind of reputation. Something he could worry about later, when the head bashing here was complete. They are about as mobile as an Elcor after a banquet, and its offensive weapons are worse than your average cruiser. But it has enough shields to shrug off most ground-based defenses and can carry almost 4,000 Batarians in addition to the crew, as well as their merchandise. Rather than the long and streamlined profiles preferred by most frigates and cruisers, Harbingers were stub-nosed and squat designs, more of a mobile space station than a fighting vessel. This was probably why they had dropped out of service when the Alliance had staked their claim on the Scythian verge. A frigate pack would make mincemeat out of such a ship without much difficulty. So not something the Normandy can kill by itself, but also not as much of a threat as the other frigates in orbit. I assume that the ships going to and from the surface are transporting people? There was a cold, hard tone to Commander Shepard's voice, which given her past was unsurprising. Most likely. Alina weighed in before Rex had a chance to mull it over, the Asari mercenary having been around long enough to have some experience in the ways of pirates and mercenaries. It makes a grim and disturbing amount of sense. Alina seemed disturbed by the Batarian's actions, and her hand reflexively went out and up to her side, obviously concerned for Nora and her own past as a captive/slave. Alina's reaction, and the hurt that appeared in her eyes when she remembered their daughter wasn't there, made Rex's blood boil in a manner that it hadn't done in decades. Bastards are assuming that, with the colony destroyed, no one would investigate closely enough to realize the people had been taken as slaves. It was only when Rex noticed Gurus backing away from him slightly, and the rest of the command deck staring at him with varying levels of concern, that he realized he had snarled his thoughts aloud. Given he seemed to have taken center stage, Rex decided that he would take advantage of it. Enough talking. What's the plan, Shepard, and how many of these Varen feed do I get to kill? There were several nods of agreement from people around the command deck, and the look Alina sent him was hungry enough that he felt his blood start to pump for an entirely different reason. Given the numerous threats, we will need to split into at least 2 teams. I will lead the team in the Mako to the asteroid's surface. If we can't stop the asteroid, anything else is pretty much pointless. Shepard was managing to restrain her anger remarkably well, though how much that was simply due to anger fatigue Rex wasn't sure. Between Saren, Cerberus, her sister, and this, even Krogan needed a break from being angry occasionally. Discussing the business side of the mission returned the room to the somber affair it had been before Rex had gotten stoked up, nobody interrupting as Shepard carried on speaking. Whilst I would like to take the fight to the bastards on the planet itself, I realize that is my personal desire rather than any tactical reasoning. I will be taking Tali, Alenko, and Gurs with me. Stopping or reversing the asteroid's engines will require considerable engineering skills, and we don't know what other surprises are waiting for us down there. It was a solid team, with Shepard acting as the powerhouse, Gurs providing range support, and the other two providing tech and biotic skills that were always useful. Another team will need to head down to the surface, either to reactivate the colony's defense grid or to bloody the nose of their assault parties. If they can do both, that isn't certainly something I won't complain about. With Alina stood next to him, Rex had to work on hiding the reaction Shepard's bloodthirsty smirk brought up. Though if what you say about this harbinger is true, Rex, the defense cannons won't be a deterrent to it destroying the colony from orbit. Rex thought about it for a moment, but he had to agree. If the defense grid is mostly intact, which given Batarian's standard attacking procedure it will be, then it would be enough to scare off the frigates. The Harbinger won't be scared off so easily, and there would be a lot of casualties if the Batarian decided the slave runs aren't worth the effort any longer. Everyone seemed a little disheartened by the news, as there was seemingly no tactic or strategy that would remove the main problem facing them. Rex noticed the silent conversation going on between the old man and his pet plant, the two of them flashing through hand signals so quickly his eyes could barely differentiate them. Naruto noticed Rex's gaze a moment later, and with 3 last hand signs he turned fully back to the gathered group, face set in a stony expression that gave nothing away. Get on with Uzumaki, you and Corporal Mari obviously have something in mind. Rex hadn't been the only one to notice the side meeting, as Shepard's bark tone made it clear that she didn't have time for the old man's joking conversations. So, the way I see it, that big hunk of metal is the only problem. Can't stop the asteroid, activate the defense systems, or kick these bastards in the proverbial nuts with it looming over us. Naruto looked at the Harbinger on the screen, and suddenly pointed to himself and Mari. So what if we have an infiltration team get aboard the thing and disable it? Take out either the engines, shields, or weapons on the thing, and suddenly it isn't a problem. There was a moment's pause, more so that people could think about the idea rather than out of shock any longer, Rex imagined, before someone pointed out what they obviously thought was an obvious problem with that plan. How do you get aboard the ship? The Batarians aren't stupid, the only way you are getting aboard is as one of their prisoners, and they won't let you board wearing armor or carrying weapons. Zavina flushed slightly as her question brought a round of chuckles from the assembled group. Obviously not the response she expected from what would normally be a reasonable point, but a wave from Shepard stopped the chuckles before the Drell could get too worked up. Sorry, forgot you're new. Despite his usual showboating and hammer-like bluntness, Naruto is actually the most competent infiltrator I have ever encountered. The combination of compliment and semi-teasing rebuke had Naruto frown a little, obviously not quite sure how to take Shepard's tone. Rex knew that the two had issues they were still working through, and given how pissed he'd been when Naruto had told him about the whole gang thing, it was understandable. But he hoped they worked it out soon, as the two of them were a lot more dangerous as leaders when they weren't tiptoeing around each other, like Krogan younglings when released from their creche for the first time. I'll take Mari and Kasumi along, be a good opportunity to test her skills. The rest of you can start wiping out the Batarians on the ground. Once we've created enough chaos on the ship, you can start up the defenses and let the fireworks begin. Naruto stated the last comment in Rex's direction, Rex taking the moment to rear up to his full height before nodding. All of this small unit stuff against Saren and his cronies had been fun, but there was something about mass combat, which is what this would no doubt become, that appealed to every Krogan on a primal level. The fact that he would be crushing a bunch of slaver scum was definitely the main point, though, definitely. Nova Terra Suburbs, 1027 May 3, 2184. Ragged Erdrikshin, Erder clansman and leader of Band First Spear. Encountering some feeble monkey resistance, these pathetic creatures had to show some SPI. Arg! Ragged would normally be happy that the voice of one of his war bands stopped filling the radio waves with nonsense. The members of the vassal Fryarch clan thought that boasting and mocking their opponents would boost their standing amongst the Erder clan. It honestly gave him a headache at the best of times, but this wasn't the first event of its type in the last few minutes. Monitoring the radio, Ragged had noticed 2 similar events that made him slightly nervous. Frogon, where are these humans? Given the rather chaotic nature of their raiding, Ragged hadn't been explicit in giving directions to the members of his band. Given the lack of meaningful resistance that had been reported so far, he hadn't thought it necessary to go to the extra effort. Batarian raiding groups didn't exactly believe in discipline anyway. Heard a heavy machine gun to the southeast. Probably caught the whiny brat by surprise. Bringing a shipment in from your west, First Spear. The voice of his brood brother and second in command made Ragged relax slightly, Loktar showing his experience even if he couldn't keep his dislike of the lesser clan warriors out of his voice. As members of the First Strike, part of the Batarian combat and raiding doctrine, most of his command were younglings and lower caste members, so the number of rifles that Ragged could count on were not worth counting on both hands. They had landed amongst the outskirts of the main population center on the planet, both to face less resistance but also to act as a buffer against any attempt at a counterattack. The fact that these losses were mounting, less than half an hour after he had seen a human frigate of some kind land somewhere to the south and then take off again minutes later, didn't take an elder to work out what was going on. Somehow a human ship had gotten through the blockade and dropped off an assault party, and Ragged wasn't about to sit around and let them ruin his day. First Spear, back to the ship. We leave in 5 minutes. A few pieces of resistance aren't worth chasing down, Bikarazdarn, Sky Spear, and this is normally used in reference to a fleet, but in this case, refers to the asteroid, will wipe them from this place. Ragged wasn't going to wait around whilst the younglings had their fun. If they wanted to fool around, then they could stick around for when the asteroid hit. His transports had already completed 3 trips to the Urda clan ship, with over 800 captives and other riches that would boost his position within the clan. If he could get another raiding run in, before the asteroid wiped this pitiful place from the galaxy, he could stake his claim on a Dekshar, frigate, command. It was a more honorable position than this role, Ragged thought imperiously as he watched the Batarians under his command arrive in disorganized groups, several of them herding groups of humans before them like the cattle they were. It was clear that the resistance to their attacks was getting more organized, as he counted less than 30 of his war band had returned by the imposed time limit. If they were actual clan Urda members, then Ragged would have felt humiliated by the 60% losses this run had suffered. But as it was, this just meant he would have to give out less of the spoils to the survivors and keep them for his own riflemen. Seeing Loktar approach, his organized force of 10 Urda clansmen forcing a mixed group of 100 humans and other aliens with them, Ragged moved from his position at the base of the transport ship to greet them. A good haul, AK, second. I see you even managed to get some mails this time. They will sell well on the colony worlds. Any trouble? Loktar shook his head before pausing and waving his left hand behind him. There was an attempted ambush as we started to return, but our organized fire drove them off without casualties. These Krotash do not have the stomach to resist us, which is a shame. There used to be glory in combating these creatures. As the humans and other captives were corralled past him and onto the transport, Ragged's eyes focused on the soulless area amongst their number. Her skin coloring was of a lighter blue color than the other blue skins he had encountered before, and despite being captured there was a clear defiance in her posture, glaring at one of the Urda clan members when he growled something at her as she passed. He hadn't had an Asari pet before, and the stubborn ones were always the most fun. Pilot, any news from the other warbands? If the other warbands were gathering as many slaves as his own team were, then there might not be space on the Svaya Tiger, Goro the second/battleship, for another run. Though they could use it as an excuse to cull the weaker members of their spoils and destroy their morale at the same time. Something he could suggest when he was back on the ship. First Sword and First Blade have been forced to withdraw with heavy casualties. Reports indicate a Krogan was the cause, but reports are limited. First Shield has been deployed to deal with the fish before it can cause any further trouble. Ragged tilted his head to the left slightly as he sent a small prayer to the gods. Krogan were one of the few races that the Batarians tried to avoid when on raiding missions. The brutes were far too much effort for any potential benefits they could offer as slaves. But First Shield consisted of almost 100 clan Urda soldiers who were actually experienced combatants. Whilst not the Urda core fighters who were plundering the main part of Terra Nova, they should be able to take care of a single Krogan, even if it was probably prompting some of the humans to actually resist as well. Get the coordinates of the Krogan. We will avoid the area if we return. No point in gaining the Shmila's attention if we don't need to. As he released the connection to the pilot, Ragged paused whilst turning to head onto the ship. For a moment, he thought he had seen a distortion in the dust and smoke of the surrounding area. But after staring for a moment longer, he shrugged the feeling off. It must have just been the wind. Harbinger Hangar, 11 o'clock May 3, 2184. Shirala, a Seri commando and former acolyte of Benezia. Quiet down, maggots. Shirala had to utilize the decades of training that she had undergone as an Asari commando to remain patient and unthreatening, torn between anger at what the Batarians were doing it, and scorn for how badly they were doing it. Looking away from the Batarian at the front of their group, who was clearly in charge given how many orders he was giving as they were moved off the transport ship and onto the Harbinger, Shiala's eyes fell upon the group of 5 men wearing baggy overalls and work gear. Stood in a semi-protective stance around the children that had been gathered by the raid. None of the Batarians had questioned why there were several more spoils amongst their plunder after the ambush that had been created as a distraction, and they hadn't even checked the slaves for weapons before they boarded the transport. Admittedly, she only had a small holdout pistol rather than her usual arsenal. But given she had spent almost a month in a cell aboard the Spectre's transport ship, having a weapon and being allowed to enter combat against slaver scum was like a balm on her soul. Dealing with the more unusual members of the Spectre's team was something she still wasn't used to, as she looked at the blonde teenager that had originally been one of the Protheans' clones of her. But given the actions of her former matriarch and her subsequent time being hosted by the Prothean, Shirala liked to think that her capacity for dealing with such bullshit was better than it had been. The fact the presence of the Prothean clone stopped the headaches she had been having with slowly growing intensity, and seemed to stabilize and strengthen her biotics beyond their previous limits, meant that Shirala could deal with having a reminder of her captivity around. Right, follow us humans, or die. As the blonde girl suddenly straightened up from her nervous posture, a determined look appearing on her face as she clicked her fingers twice, Shirala realized it was time. Whilst she had no real armaments, Shirala still had her biotics and commando training. So as they were marched out of the hangar, and into the long angular corridors of the ship's interior, she made her way to the outside of the group of captives. There were only 15 Batarians guarding them, a sign of overconfidence with how successful this raid had been, but there were at least a dozen others moving back and forth between different sections of the ship's section they were in. Most of the guards were either at the front or the back of the group, and the plan was for the Prothean clone and the blonde human to deal with those, whilst she and the others would deal with the 4 spread out along column. "Why have you stopped, girl?" The shout from behind, the Prothean clone having moved to the back of the group and then stopped to end up amongst the Batarians, was the signal Shirala needed. Unlike most of her sisters, Shirala understood the importance of subtlety regarding biotics, and the disjointed memories of what the blonde human had done to her Prothean clones had shown that brute force wasn't always the answer anyway. Thus, the Batarian she snuck up on died to a silent and controlled warp almost instantly, from the hand she placed against the back of his neck, before he even realized what was going on. One of the disguised Marines, a female that had deliberately separated from the male Marines in case the Batarians had proved even semi-competent, caught the Batarian's shotgun before it could hit the ground whilst Shirala grabbed the body. Lowering it to the floor as quickly as possible without dropping it entirely, Shirala was moving to the next target before the nearest captives could even begin to react to the brutal event. "What the?" There were several thuds and meaty splats from behind her, and as Shirala pounced on the Batarian who had just began to turn around, the shouting began. A strike to the throat crushed the Batarian's windpipe, Shirala disarming and shattering his kneecap with a biotic strike before leaving the scum to collapse to the floor grasping at his throat. Throwing the assault rifle to one of the Marines, Shirala rushed through the crowd of captives to the front of the column. Whilst the Prothean clone sounded like she had the rear guard dealt with, the blonde would need hell. As the shocked civilians parted in front of her, Shirala found the Batarian guards slaughtered to a man, with a dozen black-armored men and women moving up the corridor away from them in complete silence. Only one of them remained, skull mask only adding to his intimidating figure, as he held a finger to his mask in a show motion. Within a minute the fighting was over in this section of the ship, any Batarian found with a weapon drawn killed without mercy and barely a shot fired, the only reason the unarmed Batarians were merely captured was because they were most likely worker or slave caste members. Radio jammers had been brought along by the infiltrators, so it was highly doubtful anyone had managed to alert the other Batarians aboard the ship. Shirala had to admire the humans' compassion, even as the 20-odd Batarians were herded into one of the nearby storage rooms by the Marines. Asari commandos wouldn't have spared anyone. The skull-masked human was directing the colonists that weren't too shell-shocked into helping to remove the bodies and collect weapons and armor. Shirala, I need you to guide us to the bridge. Kasumi and Mari will be dealing with the weapon systems and Sergeant Jax will be finding the other captives. The order from the skull-masked man made Shirala realize that he was in fact the blonde human who had defeated the Thorian on Pharos. He was taller now, and more broad-shouldered, but that could just be the armor. She nodded a little unnecessarily. That had been the plan all along after all. But as those civilians that felt like fighting were given weapons and told to follow the now visibly armored Alliance Marines, she realized why he had voiced it. Not only did a plan help calm those they had rescued, but it meant the civilians were less likely to volunteer to help. Given the strange and unique powers the blonde had shown so far, the less people that saw them the better. This way. Whilst the alarm hadn't been raised yet, the blessing of the goddess would not shine upon them forever. Less talking and more action would increase their chances of getting spaced, and whilst Shirala suspected the blonde had a plan to survive such an action, she did not have the luxury of a full void suit. Urdur clanships via Tiger Blood and Contempt, 1105 May 3, 2184. Jagged Urdurken, Urdur clan leader. The first are suffering heavier losses than expected. Clan leader, Fryark and Vogel clans are reporting casualties of almost 40%. Most of these losses seem to be in the south of the city. The Urdur clan member in charge of the Blood and Contempt's communication systems, more of an overseer than an operator given the communication systems were actually run by servant or slave caste Batarians, paused as Jagged snorted. The weakness of the two clans he had brought for this mission was the exact reason why he had brought them along. Rumors of Urdur clan's weak and stagnant servant clans were starting to spread in the hegemony, and it was either use them and allow them to prove their worth, or stop pretending the two clans were anything other than meat shields and put them in their rightful place as slaves. The communications officer Blavar took his resumed silence as permission to continue his report. First Shield reported combat with Alliance military forces, though the survivors are unable to confirm the appearance of a Krogan, which was what was reported during the initial attacks. Blavardak, that was his name, seemed to steady himself before continuing in a far more cautious voice. We lost contact with First Shield shortly after that communication, and there have been no reports from them for almost 10 minutes. Blavardak was cut off as Jagged raised a hand, biotic power shimmering around the armored shock gauntlet that he had inherited when he inherited the clan from his elder brother in ritual combat. And we haven't deployed our core raiders from where they are pissing around in the center of the colony? Blavardak, to his credit, seemed to realize that lying was a bad idea and merely shook his head. Jagged wasn't stupid, and his clan didn't have enough warriors for him to start killing people off for not thinking strategically. But if there was one thing he hated enough to ignore that point, it was liars and cowards. Tell Commander Haresh to send 300 south, the rest are to withdraw. We are only here to provide support for Balak's little terrorist plot, and that doesn't require us losing most of our available raiders. Have the latest group of slaves been subdued? Turning his three-eyed gaze, as well as the milky fourth eye that unnerved so many people, away from Blavardak to the clan's security chief, Jagged's eyes narrowed as the Batarian woman didn't respond to him straight away. She was instead speaking urgently into her comm and typing into her console in an almost frantic manner, signs that indicated Jagged wasn't going to get a positive answer. We've lost contact with the returning members of First Spear, and I can't raise any of the security teams on decks 5 through to 8. Deck 9 is still responding via consoles, but they reported a disturbance in the direction of the storage rooms. I've scrambled the main security teams. She stood, and Jagged was pleased to see that she was at least planning on leading the response teams. Obviously, some of the raiders got lazy about searching for weapons. Gesturing with his arm, the 4 members of the elite clan guard he had brought on this trip moved forward. Dressed in Batarian blade armor, painted pitch black other than the bladed parts, and armed with executioner shotguns and a range of biotic and tech powers. Each of these Batarians was trained from a young age from the best of the clan's younglings. Casualties were relatively low, only about 30%, but only the very best could join the ranks of the clan guard. The other survivors were allowed to join the normal raiding bands with honor. The clan guard will lead the response teams. I have no time for a few uppity slaves to ruin such a profitable trip. The security chief nodded, though as she turned away Jaggard gave a hand signal that the clan guards would understand instantly. If the security chief did not perform courageously in reclaiming the ship, then he would use the opportunity to promote someone new to the role. Such was the nature of clan politics. Asteroid X-57, midday May 3, 2184. Jane Shepard, Council Spectre and Hero of Elysium. Away teams deployed Commander, though there are now several Batarian frigates patrolling the local area. Someone on the ground probably reported the Normandy when we landed. We will remain on station here. Judging by the frantic comms traffic we are starting to pick up, the infiltration of the Harbinger is going according to plan. Joker out. As Shepard finished listening to the combui's message, the only way the Normandy could communicate with ground teams without risking its stealth system being compromised, she felt a small amount of grim satisfaction at the news about the boarding party. Even if they stopped the asteroid and prevented the colony from being destroyed, the Batarian hegemony would just claim that it was the work of unaffiliated pirates and mercenaries. If they could capture the Harbinger though, or at least prevent it leaving the system when the Third Fleet arrived, then the number of prisoners and amount of data they would be able to extract from it would make it much harder for the Batarians to try and hide behind diplomatic red tape. Any other snipers to deal with Gurus? The Turian paused for several seconds before shaking his head. They had parked the Mako up not too far from their landing point, Tali detecting anti-vehicle mines in their path to the fusion torch control center. Since then, it had been a constant stream of snipers, patrols and booby traps. Nothing here either, Spectre. Given the number of hostiles we have neutralized, it is most likely that the rest are being held in reserve at the target facility. The voice of the Drell CSEC officer Zavina, who had volunteered to support them on the mission, made Jane nod slightly in appreciation. While she enjoyed the rather relaxed attitudes of Rex and Naruto, the Drell's professional manner was something of a soothing balm on her psyche right now. Commander, the engineers and I have managed to disable the second fusion torch with only minor resistance. Is the route clear for us to move on the third? Initially, Jane had been a little leery about leaving Alenko and Tali to clear the inside of the fusion torch buildings. Not that there had been much of a choice, given the number of Batarians that had either charged out from the main facility or been transported down from the circling Batarian frigates. But when she had taken a pause in the assault on the first fusion torch's perimeter, to review how the storming of the building was going, Tali's camera feed had shown she had nothing to worry about. The Quarian had taken to the lessons Naruto had been giving all non-military personnel remarkably well, her speed and strength far eclipsing what it had been when they had first run into her. There was also far more viciousness in the Quarian's actions than might be expected. The finger jab to partially blind a Batarian shock trooper that thought she was an easy close combat target, followed by a kick to the groin, meant the Batarian barely able to groan when Tali finished him off with a shotgun but to the head. Clear so far, Tali. How are the civilians holding up? When they had landed, they had detected several human distress signals from the area around the asteroid command center. They had been too late to save one of the engineers that had escaped the facility, but 3 survivors including Commander Atwell wasn't what she would call bad statistics. The defensive drones that one of them had managed to reactivate was certainly helpful if nothing else. Struggling with all the combat, though no problems so far. I really hope I wasn't that bad when we first met. Tali trailed off, and Shepard imagined she had just realized what she had said and gotten slightly embarrassed about what she had just said. As much as Tali had gained valuable combat experience, she was still the same socially awkward girl that was almost impossible to dislike. Commander, transport incoming. Gurus' interruption broke the slightly lifted mood, and Jane looked up to see the ship in question moving off to the southwest. Whilst the Batarians didn't know where they were currently, she would prefer to make it to the complex before getting involved in another space fight. Whilst the quality of the Batarians they were facing wasn't exactly impressive, It would only take a lucky bullet through their kinetic barriers to make a difference given they were not in atmosphere. Let's move out. Tali, we are going to storm the complex. That should keep the Batarians' focus away from you as you turn off the third fusion torch. Leaping from where she and the others had taken cover, as the asteroid didn't have much resembling a gravitic field, Jane landed almost 100 feet in the direction of the complex. Understood, Commander. See you when these Bashtets are out of the way. As she made another leaping jump, Jane hoped it would be as easy as Tali was implying. The chance to be the tip of the spear against these bastards was something that she had dreamed at since she had been a teenager, though that kind of role was never easy. They made it to the entrance of the complex just as the transport locked into their position, which meant that they would have enemies at their backs, as well as their fronts. But as the airlock pressurized and air flooded into the room, Jane was just glad that they weren't at immediate risk of decompression any longer. Multiple contacts on the other side of the door, Shepard. I am getting flashbacks to Cora's den already. Grabbing 2 of the grenades from her belt, Shepard tossed them the moment the interior doors started to open, ducking to the side as a fusillade of bullets filled the opening a moment later. The flash bang and ECM grenade went off a moment later. Only the fact that her team's armor was keyed to the grenade signal meant they were able to move freely. It was a creation that she had commissioned the Quarians on the Ontario for after overhearing the end part of a discussion between Naruto and Rex about configuring some old suits into training suits by changing the programming of the movement systems. My armor? The Quarians had created a system that hacked every piece of armor within 30 meters, and as Jane bull rushed through the airlock as it finished opening, she concluded that it would be worth every piece of Geth tech she had promised the Ontario's captain for her crew's work. The Batarians in light and medium armor were moving at a sluggish pace, and though several of them fired on her, they couldn't keep up with her rapid charge. The Batarians in heavy armor weren't even combat capable, several of them screaming as their servos twisted their limbs at unnatural angles, the armor causing more damage as many of them strained to counteract the effect. Machine gun. The heavy weapons, set up further back in the station, opened up even as Jane gunned down a whimpering Batarian raider whose heavy armor had forced him to perform an impromptu split. The bullets sighed across the relatively small corridor, the now unshielded Batarians mowed down like wheat even as Jane's barrier took several bruising hits. Poor bastards. Having held a grudge against the Batarian state for her entire adult life, Jane was aware that even Batarians weren't safe from their barbaric social structure, and given the disregard for their lives she assumed the ones near the airlock had been low-level caste members at best. As the machine gun fire shifted to the other side of the corridor, Jane leaned out and prepped a biotic throw, the Batarian raider manning the machine gun screaming invectives as he tried to bring his weapon back across to target her. The throw caught him in the face, even as the first mass effect rounds slammed into her barrier. Her barrier held for the first 3, her shield taking 2 bullets before shattering after partially absorbing the force of the last bullet. It slammed into her shoulder, but didn't penetrate her armor, leaving several cracks along its surface. But as the Batarian was sent flying backwards before impacting the wall behind him with a satisfying crunch, Jane felt it was a suitable exchange. There were several other Batarians at the far end of the entrance corridor, but one of them fell to the combined sniper fire of Gurus and Zavina before they even realized their heavy support was neutralized. With the 2 snipers pinning down the reinforcements, Jane scanned the downed Batarians quickly. The last thing she wanted was for one of them to recover enough to attack them in the back. Of the 15 Batarians that had been waiting directly outside the airlock, only 4 of them were still alive as far as she could tell, several of them torn in half by the heavy fire they had received from their comrades. Of the survivors, 2 were probably going to bleed out before the combat was over, but the other 2 were only in light armor and had ducked into cover when the HMG opened up. Judging by the fact that neither of them were firing in her team's direction, Jane assumed the 2 Batarians weren't particularly confident that they wouldn't come under fire from both directions if they did. "This is Commander Jane Shepard, Butcher of the Clans and Council Spectre." As she announced her identity in a wideband broadcast, Jane decided to use the name the Batarians used for her, rather than the hero title she had been given. She was trying to be intimidating after all. "Drop your weapons and surrender. This is your only warning." Normally she wouldn't bother, especially with someone trying to wipe out a human colony. But as one of the two hiding Batarians threw down his rifle into the main walkway, and proceeded to start arguing with the other Batarian rather fervently, Jane knew that the Batarians would be one of the few races such a view was actually reasonable. Despite her hatred of the raiding clans, her personal experience and research meant she knew exactly how many raiders weren't there out of choice. As she moved up towards the location the two Batarians were using as cover, using her biotics to lift one of the reinforcements in the air as she did so, her approach seemed to make the Batarians' minds up. They both dropped to one knee, with heads tilted back and eyes wide open, the Batarian stance of complete surrender. "Peace, Spectre, we of the Galkvar clan present ourselves to your mercy." Galkvar? Jane hadn't heard of the clan, but given there were literally thousands of them in the hegemony alone, that was hardly a surprise. Slave clan? There was a slight growl from the Batarian who had taken longer to drop their weapon, but after a moment she nodded her head. Shepherd! Gur's cry alerted Shepherd to the fact that they had to keep moving, and that left her with a choice that had no good outcomes. "Are there others of your clan here?" The female Batarian tilted her head forward so that her lower set of eyes met Jane's, the upper set darting in the direction of the corridor when the machine gun fire started up again. "Here, and on the ships, we are the meat for the clans." Shepherd took a moment longer to think on the matter, leaning out to fire another throw at the slowly growing number of Batarians crowding at the end of the corridor. "How do you feel about the chance to get back at your masters?" Kicking one of the downed rifles in the Batarian's direction, Jane knew she was taking a chance, as the Batarians took their honor and caste system seriously, even those at the bottom of the ladder. But judging by the feral grin that crossed the female Batarian's face, as she kicked the rifle up into her grip, they weren't above getting revenge against those that sacrificed them like sheep. Chapter 21, Bring Down the Sky, Part 2. Urder Clanship, Deck 4, 1:30 p.m. May 3, 2184. Naruto Uzumaki, Alliance Lieutenant and Spectre Soldier. "Well, if we didn't know where the bridge was before." Naruto chuckled to himself slightly as Shirala sent an unimpressed look his way. Some people just didn't appreciate humor under heavy machine gun fire, it seemed. They had taken the first two decks with relative ease, his shadow clones moving like shades of the Shinigami to deal with the off-duty Batarian raiders and crew members, knocking out non-combatants, and leaving them under the guard of his clones. Whilst he had every intention of keeping some of the actual Batarian raiders alive, Jane-chan needed witnesses and evidence to use against the other Batarians. After all, Deck 5 had included the leisure area for the raiders. The things that had been happening there, suddenly Naruto had been a lot more understanding of Shepard's view about the bug-eyed slaver bastards. Needless to say, there had been more blood spilled than was strictly necessary. Another squad trying to flank us. The black-armored ones seemed to be holding back for now. Shirala punctuated her statement with a steady burst of assault rifle fire, catching at least one Batarian moving between cover, her biotic ammunition tearing through armor and flesh with ease. After Naruto and his clones cleansed the fifth deck, it was clear that the Batarian crew were now aware of their ship invasion. Every corridor was now littered with improvised bulwarks and traps, and many of the rooms were either fortified or booby-trapped, in some cases both. "Well, if they're focusing on us, they aren't going after the others anymore." Naruto punctuated his comment by charging out from the cover they had taken as a temporary bastion, shields flickering under the fire of the few Batarians able to keep up with him. But whereas the earlier lightning strike-style assaults had shattered whatever group was obstructing them, the group of Batarians he was charging towards didn't panic, turning as an almost coordinated group towards the charging human and unleashing a wall of flames. Shit! It was only a quick substitution from the clone he had been keeping back deliberately for this kind of issue that stopped Naruto from finding out what being barbecue felt like. That wasn't much fun. It was a sign that the Batarians were getting organized and catching on to his lightning-style assaults, something Naruto had been hoping they were either too stupid or off guard to manage. "Lieutenant. Less than 30 minutes before the planned event. We need that ship offline, otherwise the colony will be devastated." The live communication from the Normandy was a better indicator of the seriousness of the situation than its content. Such a communication meant that the Normandy had effectively pinged itself to the various Batarian ships, and whilst Joker was no doubt moving the ship away or perhaps leaving a comms buoy to mislead the Batarians, it wouldn't work for long. The event that Joker was talking about was the arrival of the Third Fleet into the Exodus cluster, something that would no doubt be picked up by the Batarian scout ships in short order, but they hoped the Batarians would assume they were referring to the asteroid. Still, that wasn't something Naruto really had time to think about right now, as their cover received another battering of grenade explosions and munitions fire. He had his timetable, and it looked like he would need to bring out some of his bigger guns to make sure he was on time. Try not to get your arm blown off, brat. Or do, I suppose that could make this more interesting. The helpful comments from QB showed that the giant fox had finished sleeping for the moment, though it did seem to spend most of its time doing that these days. Turning to Shirala, he did his best to signal that she should hunker down defensively, as she had been captured and didn't have her headgear to allow for easy comms communication. He wasn't sure how successful he was, but the wave of flames rolling over their rapidly deteriorating cover meant he needed to act now. Channeling chakra into his arm, Naruto stood as the flames stopped for a moment, his armor barely holding under the weight of fire in his direction before he unleashed his strike. He barely had time to see the nearest Batarian's eyes widen in shock, before his attack slammed into the closing flamethrower-wielding soldiers, and everything went white. The shockwave that slammed him backwards told him that clearly something had gone wrong, or very, very right depending on how you looked at it. The sudden pull on his body in the direction of the attack told him it was probably the former. Chakra-enhanced hands dug into the steelwork of the floor beneath him as his vision began to clear, keeping him in place as he saw the results of his small attack. About 20 meters from where they had been hunkered down, the corridor was pretty much demolished, great rents in the floor, walls and roof, sputtering flames and sticky liquid covering most of those surfaces. Judging by the pull that was coming from that direction, Naruto had to assume that at least one of these rents had caused damage to the external structure of the ship, and that he was currently at risk of being, what was the word Shepard had used? As he saw Shirala grabbing frantically at the wall of the barricade, Naruto realized that the ringing in his ears wasn't from the explosion any longer, rather a ship alarm along with a deep Batarian voice shouting something in the Batarian language that his suit translator wasn't currently translating. He could see a pair of heavy blast doors closing slowly ahead of them, past the area currently venting atmosphere, and he assumed there was a similar process happening along the two other routes that lead from their current position. He wouldn't waste time looking, as he could see several Batarians doing their best to reach the doors, in a manner that he could only describe as desperate. It was time for a seat of his pants type plan, something that Naruto knew annoyed the strategists amongst his friends. Given he still needed to make it to the bridge to disable the Harbinger, Naruto turned his grip into the deck floor from a clinging point to a push-off point, getting his legs underneath his body as he twisted to face the direction he wanted to go. Shirala had about half a second's warning as he pushed off from the floor, while running towards her at the greatest speed he could manage. Leaping off and using the pull of the tear to his advantage, Naruto arced past her position and grabbed her flailing arm, dragging her with him as he created several clones. These clones worked together to form a series of steps for him to push off of as he buelled through the destroyed section, shifting Shirala behind him as one of the black-armored Batarians noticed their approach and raised his shotgun. A warp that slammed into the Batarian before he could fire reminded him that his passenger was far from helpless, and the attack bought them the time he needed to get through the blast doors. Creating almost 100 clones to deal with the remaining Batarians in this section of the ship, as the time for subtlety had most definitely passed now, Naruto turned his attention to the white-armored Batarian lying on the floor nearby. His first assumption, that he had been the captain of the ship given the bodyguards and white armor, was proven wrong as the two remaining black-armored Batarians were withdrawing from his clone onslaught, rather than attacking in an attempt to retrieve him. The Batarian was still groggy, but as her helmet began to move she seemed to realize who was stood in front of her, and the panic in her body language was clear and easy for Naruto to see. "Now, Batarian-san, I have some questions for you, and you better hope that I like your answers." Given he was still wearing his skull epitaph mask, and had just blown apart what seemed to be a good portion of the ship's most competent security team with a single attack, Naruto was feeling fairly confident of his chances in making the Batarian talk quickly. Asteroid X-57, 1:23 p.m. May 3, 2184. Jane Shepard, Council Spectre and hero of Elysium. You humans. As she strode into the center of the atrium-style room that served as the building's main open space, Jane wasn't surprised to find a tall black-armored Batarian stood at the top of the stairs in front of her. Flanked on either side by particularly monstrous-looking Varen, while almost 24 Batarian soldiers moved into cover on either side of him. Such numbers would normally worry Jane a little, but the sounds of movement behind her told her Zavina and Gurus were moving into position, along with almost 30 Galkvar clan members who were still capable of fighting. You are almost as much trouble as the impertinent slaves that seem to think you will save them from their rightful place in the galaxy. The Batarian, Balak, if the name given by one of the surviving Galkvar members had given her was correct, was so angry that his arms were shaking slightly as his hands curled into fists. Well, you know how the human saying goes, all attempted genocide and no play makes you look like a dick on a stick. Jane wasn't in the best of moods herself. There had been almost 200 Batarians to fight to get to this point, and the cramped rooms and corridors played into the defender's hands more than her own. There had even been one of the Batarians who had been arrogant enough to assume he could negotiate their escape with her, by claiming he had nothing to do with the plan of dropping the asteroid onto Terra Nova, merely thinking the plan had been a slaving raid. As if that made things any better, something she made very clear by beating him into unconsciousness with the arm she had biotically blown off. She had enjoyed beating the bastard into the ground a little too much. Perhaps Rex was starting to rub off on her. Still, the bastard would live, maybe. Still, she wanted evidence that the hegemony government itself was behind this attack, so she tried to actually do things by the book for a change. Release your hostages, surrender yourself and your men now, and I might let the council do the questioning rather than doing it myself. A small snarling noise erupted from one of the Batarians in cover near Balak, who merely spat on the floor in obvious disdain. I do not answer to the council, or their murderous dogs. Still, I wanted to see the butcher of the clans for myself. You're smaller than I expected given the horror stories. Maybe the stories are merely about your horrific features instead. A click in her ear, a signal from Zavina that she had her sniper rifle set up and ready to fire, made Shepard shook her head as she took a step forward and drew the Batarian combat blade she was more than slightly infamous for. Why don't you come down and size up against me personally then, rather than hiding behind hostages like the craven you are, Dukashat, Batarian equivalent of bottom feeder? Then again, I suppose the hegemony have always hidden behind words when its actions have risked reprisals of a dangerous nature. Unfortunately, her attempt to anger Balak into revealing whether or not he was working directly for the hegemony didn't seem to have worked, as Balak merely snarled for a moment before shaking his head and continuing. And you humans always assume that you are righteous in your actions, such as your defense of the Skyllian Verge, when we were already colonizing it before your kind even had mass effect technology. The slaughter you carried out there, in the name of self-defense, makes even the Alliance's actions on Torfan pale in comparison. There were several barked agreements from Balak's Batarians, the tension in the room causing his Varen to claw at the ground restlessly, and snap their jaws in obvious hunger. Jane knew that the point about the Skyllian Verge being settled was not entirely incorrect. It was something that some in the Alliance military likened to the settling of the Americas by the European powers almost 700 years beforehand. But there hadn't been any raids or any aggressive attacks by the Alliance as they colonized the Verge, despite the almost constant raiding and slave-taking attempts by Batarian pirates, not until the Skyllian Blitz at least. Balak slammed his hand into the atrium's polished granite stair handrail, causing the surface to crack and splinter, before continuing his furious monologue. And did the council help us against the vermin infesting our space and stealing resources that should have been ours? No, they left us to defeat and humiliation, all because they thought fighting the humans would be more trouble than it was worth. Or, more likely, the council had its own grievances with the hegemony. It wouldn't be the first time the council used a proxy to deal with a problem of theirs rather than actually come up with a solution themselves. But in this case, Shepard thought they hadn't gone far enough. Perhaps they felt that the Batarians had overstepped their bounds, or maybe they just remembered Manavai. Actually, it was probably Ezen, as there were almost 100,000 Asari on that world before you brought it peacefully into the hegemony. Strange that none of them were ever heard from again. Normally, Jane wouldn't be trying so hard to push her enemies to continue monologuing, but Tali was currently using a remote hack into Kate Bowman's Omni tool to try and defuse the bomb that had been placed with the hostages. Thankfully, Jane had convinced the young engineer to stop trying to contact them after her second attempt to help. As useful as the information about the Batarian numbers had been, there had been too big a risk of her being caught and killed by the Batarians. Enough. It seemed that she had finally touched a nerve through the already shaky control Balak had on his emotions, the Batarian thrusting a hand up and out dismissively, a motion that had guns on both sides being readied. As much as I would like to deal with you, and the vermin who you associate with, I have other things to do. Such as running away like a coward with his tail between his legs, Jane thought bitterly, as Balak showed he had a dead man's switch in his other hand. So either you stand down and let us leave, or I blow up the hostages and the clanship will unleash death and fire on your filthy colony. Leaving their deaths on your conscience, if you still have one, of course. There was half a second of indecision, where Shepard mentally analyzed the distance between them. A biotic charge could cover that distance if she got the jump on him. But the chances of her grabbing the switch before he released the button weren't exactly great, and even that wouldn't stop the clanship if Naruto's team hadn't managed to disable it yet. And the Batarian attack so far had been bad enough. An orbital bombardment would almost certainly devastate the colony for decades to come. You do realize that there will be no shithole dark enough and deep enough to stop me finding you? As she signaled her forces to stand aside, though none of them lowered their weapons beyond half-cock the entire time, Shepard uttered a promise she had every intention of keeping. That, Commander Shepard, is something I am counting on. Balak's face was understandably smug, as he moved down the steps and walked past her, his Varen following behind before his troops ran after him. It was only after they had all left the room, with Tali announcing apologetically a minute later that she had isolated the bombs from any external signals to detonate, that Shepard allowed herself to smile. Normandy, make sure you keep track of any signal that leaves the surface before I do. That's the bug we want to follow. It was one of the reasons it had taken Shepard as long as she had to get to the main room. All of the Batarian ships that had been docked with the asteroid's base had been given gifts of tracking beacons and navigational bug programs. Spectre, not that we wish to question your plan, but letting Balak escape. This had come from the female Batarian who she had initially pitched the revolt to, who had proved more than a decent combatant once the restrictions on her armor and shields had been removed. We focus on saving people first, JV Carey. Besides, there is an old saying on Earth. Grudges are for those who feel they are owed something. Gesturing towards the door Balak had left through just before, Shepard used the same dismissive gesture he had used at her. And I don't want to deal with the idea of that bastard owing me anything. Svaya Tiger Blood and Contempt, Command Deck, 2:04 p.m. May 3, 2184. Jaggard Erderken, Erder Clan Leader. What do you mean we cannot use the weapons systems? Jaggard was well beyond the end of his admittedly short tether of patience now, the still smoking corpse of the security team member next to his command chair a clear reminder of this point for the rest of the Batarians in view. The fool had come back to report they were rapidly losing ground to a human onslaught, obviously thinking that his cowardice in running from the enemy rather than stamping them into the ground would go unnoticed. But given the continued loss of communications to both the security chief and his clan guard, Jaggard was now starting to think that he had perhaps been a little hasty in killing the Craven straight away. Perhaps he should have focused on getting more information about this onslaught first. Someone has hacked into our systems. It's all we can do to keep them from breaching our shield systems. If the security teams can't drive them back soon. At Bovardak's almost panicked response, Jaggard wanted to scream in frustration, both at the incompetence of his people and at that bastard Balak. This was meant to be an easy mission, a chance for easy glory and credits that would have seen his clan rise through the ranks in the hegemony. Now his clanship was being overrun, his raiders were getting mauled by a fish and a ragtag group of rebellious sheep, and now Balak wasn't answering his calls. Jaggard suddenly stilled in place, his mind working in overdrive as he thought back to the way the mission had been presented by Balak and his overseer master. With dawning horror and the cold feeling of betrayal in his stomach, Jagged realized that the mission had been sold to him too generously. Balak only demanded 10% of the overall profits that would have been made from the slaves, a figure low enough that Jagged hadn't even tried to haggle, and the Batarian Black Ops commander hadn't mentioned any of the salvage or other items Jagged had been reclaiming from Terra Nova. It's a trap. A trap by those overseer bastards. Obviously one of the other, more powerful clans had felt threatened by his clan's rise through the ranks, and had used some kind of leverage to get the overseers to send him on this mission. It obviously wasn't all going to plan, given the arrested descent of the asteroid that had occurred in the last 10 units. But if Balak had managed to get himself killed on this seeming suicide mission, then the Riduki deserved nothing less. The Alliance had been warned of their arrival. There was no other explanation for the assault teams on the ground and on his ship. The reports of an Alliance ship landing on the surface of the planet, despite none of his ships being able to get a reading of any ships in or off the planet, meant that the rumors of a new secret Alliance ship were almost definitely true. And that meant, contact the scout frigates, they are to activate active scanning now. Even as Bavardok stilled for a moment in obvious confusion at his unelaborated order, Jagged was activating his captain's terminal, doing his best to work out what forces he still had available to him. The truth wasn't something that made him feel confident. They still had the clan's 8 frigates, the Surf clan's 4 frigates who were currently acting as scouts, and the majority of their attached crews, as well as about half of the raider forces who were still on the ground in the city. But that was less than a third of the manpower that Jagged had brought to this fight, and with the way the crew transponders were disappearing off his tactical map at a rapid rate, he would lose the clan ship in less than 10 units. They are reporting nothing, clan. Wait, multiple inbound vessels. That was the last war blade in the back for Jagged, and a sign that he needed to act now if he wanted to avoid the clan's complete destruction. Recall all raiders, tell them to withdraw to the clan frigates instead of here. All clan frigates are to prepare to withdraw in 5 units, whether or not their crews are all back. The scouts are to withdraw at full speed and head on a solar slingshot trajectory. We will disperse into the far reaches of the sector, and then lightning strike through the relay. Standard dark run protocols. It wouldn't matter for the Surf clan frigates, they wouldn't be able to outrun the approaching Alliance frigate wolf packs, but at least if they tried to run, they would end up being destroyed rather than surrendering. His clan would already be the scapegoat of this debacle. He needed to avoid giving the Alliance any more evidence to hunt down each and every one of them. Even as the different members of the crew tried to carry out his order, whilst also trying to ask what they were going to do about those boarding the clan ship, Jagged activated a program only accessible through the captain's console and with his biometric identification. The male baritone of his own voice recording blared out on the speaker system in the room. Warning, ship self-destruct sequence initiated. Ship destruction in 3 units. It was about 7 of the humans' blasted minutes, more than enough time for Jagged and the bridge crew to use the escape pods based on this deck. Given he had fired all the escape pods from the lower levels in the same activation, the bastards trying to take his ship were going to be in for one hell of a surprise. Even as he stood from his chair though, with every intention of being the first in the escape pods, Jagged couldn't shake the feeling he was being watched by someone. But looking around for a moment, he was sure the crew were all too busy carrying out their last instructions to waste time looking at him. Given the multitude of emotions that were currently swirling in his chest, most of which fueling his anger, Jagged brushed off the feeling as simple frustration and the desire to lash out at someone. And he had enough targets for his ire when he got out of this mess, starting with that bastard Balak. Sir, Frigate Kael Shalek, young-blooded or virile, is not responding to our hails at all, and has been moving to the edge of sensor range for several units. Jagged didn't even try and hold in the stream of filth and fury that erupted from his mouth, expletives following curses as he stormed towards the nearest escape pod. That ship had been the one he loaned to carry Balak's terrorist forces, so obviously the gutless worm had already been running by the time the message had come through to target the colony with the clan ship's weapons. Reaching the escape pod, already mostly filled with the various officers and crew assigned to weapons control or piloting the ship, Jagged activated the escape pod's door system. There were still 2 or 3 empty seats, but with the majority of the security elsewhere, it wasn't as if there would be a lack of seats on the other pods. Barely 30 seconds later, the rest of the bridge crew had made it to the escape pods, and to Jaggard's surprise, the launch sequence began immediately. It shouldn't have been possible without his Omni-Tool's authorization to prevent cowardice or mutiny in the face of battle. The only other place it could be activated from was. Ripping himself out of his seat, Jaggard reached the small viewport from the escape pod into the ship. Just as the escape pods activated and he was thrown bodily against the hatch, Jaggard caught sight of a hooded human sat in his captain's chair, the woman throwing him a casual wave even as they raced off into the depths of space. The escape pods were locked onto the nearest frigate, and even as he was able to drag himself to a chair, all Jaggard could do was use his Omni-Tool to begin a system-wide data wipe of the clan ship. How much good it would do, with an infiltrator already on his bridge, Jaggard didn't know. But his focus was now on surviving the next few days. Then he could start plotting how his clan would come back from this, and who exactly was going to pay for this betrayal. Command Deck, SSV Logan, 10:15 p.m. May 3, 2184. James Anderson, Human Alliance Captain. Bleary eyes looking at a watch that feels both too tight and too loose at the same time, Anderson internally regrets not taking up Admiral Singh's offer of a bunk when he arrived in orbit over Terra Nova. He had been up for almost 36 hours at this point. Between coordinating the Alliance 3rd and 5th Fleet response to the possible attack on Terra Nova and then commandeering the SSV Serengeti when they received confirmation from the Ontario that the Normandy had gone dark for at least 6 hours, all but confirming the attack was taking place. The Serengeti had been docked with the Citadel as part of Vice Admiral Mihailovich's attempt to inspect and report on the Normandy. And given the scuttlebutt about what had occurred between Mihailovich and Shepard, Anderson had taken more than a little bit of personal enjoyment at presenting Udina's signed instructions to head to Terra Nova with all speed, leaving the man with less than half his crew when they undocked. Communications with the captured Batarian ship established Admiral, Normandy and the Citadel are also connected. The clear, concise report brought Anderson's flagging attention back to where he was now, aboard the command deck of the SSV Logan, standing with Admirals Singh and Mihailovich by the communications terminal. "Thank you, Tucker. Patch them through, please." Befitting a dreadnought, the communications terminal of the SSV Logan was far larger and more complex than even the one on board a prototype frigate like the Normandy. It could communicate over much greater distances easily, and more importantly, it could serve as a hub to allow multiple calls to be connected directly to each other. Standing in the middle of the circular apparatus, which would transmit his image to the receiving stations, Anderson knew that Admiral Singh would not cast a particularly commanding image to those receiving their broadcast. At 54 and with a wiry build, the Admiral often had to be mounted on a podium when making speeches in public to ensure he could be easily seen. But his underwhelming physique was merely something Singh used to his advantage more often than not, and the enemies of the Alliance had learned their mistake far too late, far too often. "This is Admiral Nurjar Singh, of the Human Alliance 3rd Fleet, in command of the SSV Logan. I have Vice Admiral Mihailovich of the 63rd Scout Flotilla and Captain Anderson with me. I hear you and your team are responsible for preventing these Batarian bastards from destroying Terra Nova. Commander Shepard, job well done all round." There was an angry hiss over the communications for a moment, before the familiar figure of the commander appeared. "I wouldn't throw insults around about all Batarians so quickly, Admiral, though it is good to hear from you again, Nurj." Anderson's eyebrow quirked slightly as Shepard of all people told someone off for insulting Batarians, especially given the last few days, but then the commander moved to the side and a Batarian appeared in the picture. Given the rarity of Batarian women amongst the higher-ranked members of the Batarian hegemony, it was only the third time that Anderson had encountered one face-to-face. Compared to the curved ridges of male Batarians, the smooth ridges of cartilage sharper and more defined on a thinner face, almost enclosing the Batarian's 4 eyes in a protective bone shield. It was a shock to the others as well, though Singh hid his reaction relatively well, as Commander Shepard continued speaking. "This is J.V. Carey Glavkar, former slave caste of the Urder clan and interim clan head until they have a decision from us as to how they can proceed. We have just under 300 of her clan currently aboard the former Urder clan ship, Given the animosity that will no doubt be rife amongst the survivors, it was the only place we could take them. I gave them the choice of entering Alliance custody until the situation calmed itself, but they preferred another option offered to them. And what option would that be, Spectre Shepard? Given the fact that this is the second attack on Alliance personnel by suspected hegemony forces in less than 2 cycles, I am surprised you are giving them a choice at all. There wasn't obvious hostility in the question from the Turian counselor for once, and Anderson could only assume that the severity of the situation had forced the Turian to evaluate his actions. Is this thing working? I hear Jane Taishu and some Rajan I don't recognize, but I can't see any of you. Kasumi-chan, can you? Thanks. As the fourth image appeared in a burst of static, answering the question of the Turian counselor indirectly at the same time, Anderson couldn't help but chuckle at the figure that appeared. Lounged on what could only be the captain's chair of the Batarian capital ship, though it honestly looked more like a throne than anything else, was Naruto Uzumaki. Judging by the sigh that could be heard from the council's connection, it wasn't just him that could already tell how much more interesting this call was going to get. Jane Taishu. Apologies, the Batarians did a number on the ship's systems when they were abandoning it, and I'm only one man despite the help of my new crew. The joke got chuckles from pretty much everyone who was in the know, whilst Singh gave a bemused look. Apologies, as I quite clearly have missed something. I assume you are a member of Shepard's team given the differential term that you use in addressing her, even if your tone does not match it. Whilst for most it would be seen as a rebuke, Anderson knew better. Singh was an operative first and foremost, the whole Admiral business something that the man sometimes claimed happened by accident. As such, he was far more relaxed in terms of rank and address than most in the Alliance hierarchy. Sorry Gigi, thought Anderson-san would have filled you in. I am not officially a member of Jane Taishu's team. Think of me more as a private citizen who happens to be accompanying them and decided to help fight these pirates. That was suspicious, to the point that the hairs on the back of Anderson's neck were half raised by the time Uzumaki gave his usual disarming smile, the suspicion only getting greater when Shepard didn't disagree with him. Pirates? These were no mere pirates, boy. We have more than a dozen recorded ship signals fleeing the planet when the Third Fleet arrived, and that is ignoring the monstrosity you are currently lounging around on. There was a bark of laughter born from relief, from the council line of all places, as Mihailovich took a step into the middle of the room. Now watch and see how it looks from outside Spiritus. The words, obviously intended to be quieter than they actually were, made everyone pause for a moment. Then there were chuckles from everyone who had seen the interactions between the Council and Naruto at different points. Actually, the Normandy recorded 14 frigates and a cruiser in addition to this ship, though one of them had almost left the system by the time the Batarians started to flee. In addition to the 2 the Third Fleet managed to destroy, the Normandy was the one who disabled the other 3. Interesting how having a ship with a stealth drive proved so useful. Anderson didn't even try to hide the proud smile on his face as his protege threw the Vice Admiral's view on the Normandy back in his face. And you think that is something to boast about? It is no doubt because of your ship and your actions that the Batarians knew of our approach. So, for future reference, it is your preference in case of an enemy attack on one of our colonies, for us to do nothing and let the colony be destroyed? Or do you mean we let thousands of citizens get abducted and taken into slavery so that the Alliance can have its heroic space battles? Shepard had obviously been learning from Uzumaki, the non-confrontational tone and body language somehow emphasizing the absurdity of the position Mihailovich was taking. Before Mihailovich could hope to respond, Uzumaki cut into the argument like a snake in the grass. And where is your proof that this isn't Pirates Vice Admiral-san? Whilst the ninja was still lounging in what was obviously meant to be a relaxed manner, his tone had lost most of its cheeriness as his eyes fixed on Mihailovich. Contrary to what you obviously believe, Batarians aren't stupid. Well, that's stupid, sorry Carrie-san. Uzumaki raised a hand in apology towards the Batarian with Shepard before continuing, though Anderson noted that the Batarian didn't look all that offended. Anything that could have been considered incriminating evidence on the ship was wiped before they even arrived in system, and the captain then initiated a data purge on the rest when he left. With the choice between preventing the ship's self-destruct mechanism, or saving the data, there wasn't much of a choice. Uzumaki paused at this point, his gaze daring someone to try and imply they had done the wrong thing. From what we can gather from the captured Batarians and the remaining data, this is just a relatively minor clan, who are at best ambitious if not just plain greedy. Even with proof that Balak team was here, all the Batarian government have to do is disown his actions and claim he acted on his own, somehow absolving them of any damage or guilt caused by their agent. There is a recent precedent for such things after all. There was an awkward cough from Shepard at this point. Obviously Uzumaki had overstepped some line that had been agreed before this call, but he had an unfortunate point that no one could really contradict. What Naruto is trying to say, Vice Admiral, is that this is no different than the attack on Elysium. We know they did it, but there is no direct link to any of the governmental bodies in the hegemony. They've been doing this since before we had space flight. To keep getting away with it, they need to be somewhat competent at covering their tracks. Shepard was clearly unhappy about this outcome, which given her past was hardly surprising, but he doubted even Mihailovich would try and call out the hero of Elysium over Elysium. Well, that's all well and good, Shepard, but the Alliance will be launching a full investigation into this. We have the resources that your team do not, so when we take those ships, we might find something incriminating. Anderson did his best not to let his tired body bristle at the sound of Udina's voice over the communication net. Why had the man sent him all the way here if he was going to be piggybacking onto the Council's call? Still, the ambassador was missing the obvious point the two confidants were trying to make, something even Anderson's exhausted brain had clocked onto. Surely, Ambassador, a Council-led investigation, both into the attack of one of its specters and the following attack on your colonies by a rogue clan would be better? We would have to send specters into Batarian space to ensure that there was no evidence of hegemony involvement, whilst the Alliance double, or even triple their anti-pirating forces around their colonies. Then, even if the Batarians claim there is bias, they cannot do anything but provide us full access, or risk war. The Asari counselor, whose name escaped Anderson's tired mind right now, seemed to have clocked onto what the Spectre and her companion had concocted in their own heads. Still, it was probably best he intercedes and point out the other advantages, before Udina became his usual bitter self and thought he was being attacked rather than just told he was incorrect. And of course, if this is the act of a rogue clan, or pirates, then the hegemony have to disavow all claims to the people and equipment involved in both attacks, making a mockery of their previous protest about the attack on Commander Shepard and reducing the risk of reprisals against the former slave caste members. And when we begin a systematic cull of every pirate lair in the terminus, in response to this unprovoked and unsupported attack, they can do nothing about it. And the bastards would still probably think they had gotten away almost scot-free, meaning that there wouldn't be a massive uptick in unrelated pirate attacks that happen to originate from hegemony space. We have 7 specters on their way to hegemony space. We originally planned on sending only 3 to begin with, but all of them volunteered. I think the hegemony is going to find out exactly how bad an idea attempting to assassinate a specter is. And the amount of havoc one specter could cause was something that Shepard had been making clear over the last few months. What a team of coordinated, and from the sound of it vengefully enthusiastic, specters could do was something Anderson didn't particularly want to imagine. Well, maybe as the Batarians were the targets, he did. Good to hear, though I wouldn't mind going to do some investigating myself. I think the work I was doing on the Citadel speaks for itself. It wasn't just Anderson that winced at the reminder of the paperwork debacle that had arisen due to Uzumaki's spring cleaning. It was true that crime was down almost 20% compared to the previous galactic year, but the mess left behind had been daunting to say the least. But as we still have Saren team to hunt down, I will resist my urges for the time being. There was a collective sigh of relief from everyone bar the 2 Alliance personnel that hadn't dealt with Naruto, giving Shepard the chance to move the conversation forward. As any involvement from my team in the investigation will have the Batarians screaming from their pulpit, we will hand over the captured frigates and Urda clan members that we have captured over to the Council's investigators as soon as we can. My repair teams are already working to make the disabled ships functional enough for a trip through the Mass Effect relay. The elephant in the room, or at least the blonde sat on top of this particular elephant, made itself known with a dismissive snort as he finally stood up. But if you want to access my ship's data banks, your investigators will need to book a time slot in advance. I am a busy man after all. Naruto's sudden comment made it clear why he had announced himself as a private citizen earlier in the report, and why he and Shepard had focused on calling the Batarians pirates. In response to the Batarian pirating attacks, prior to the attack on Elysium and the purging of Torfan, the Alliance had authorized privateering for the first time in almost 3 centuries. Whilst most private citizens didn't have access to the materials or manpower to be able to contribute, there had been several prominent figures and private security companies who had been more than happy to take the commissions offered on Batarian pirate ships captured. The fact they got to keep the ships as well was, of course, the real motivation behind the patriotism many of these new privateers showed. And, as far as Anderson was aware, the anti-pirating prize law was never revoked, given the continued if reduced threat of pirates in the lawless areas of the galaxy. You are invoking the prize law? I suppose as this is Alliance space it does apply, though I don't think the Commission ever covered ships of this size. There was quiet for a moment, as everyone digested this rather shrewd political move from Shepard and her team, before the Spiritus spoke up, his voice approving for once. I have read of this law. There are several members of the Turian military that are petitioning for a similar law to be enacted. But surely you... I see where this is going. I am sure if we look at the records, you are waiting for the data transfer in order to officially induct people into your service as a Spectre? Naruto's face gave the slightest of twitches as Spiritus managed to see the trap he was about to drop face first into, a sign that the ninja was disappointed no doubt. To his credit, the Turian counselor was a lot more collected than he had been in all the previous interactions Anderson had seen with this pair. At Shepard's somewhat curt nod, Spiritus looked at his fellow counselors for a moment before sighing and speaking once more. You will have what files we can salvage by the end of the day. We will also send you all the standard Spectre documentation and training files, which honestly, we should have done separately. The reason we didn't transfer anything before was because when Saren was outed, he released several highly advanced cyber parasites into the Council's systems, focused primarily on his record and mission history. Spiritus' face was quite pained at this groundbreaking revelation, though given the Turians' dogged defense of Saren, both publicly and privately, the betrayal must have been quite personal. Even after our cyber teams managed to isolate and purge these attacks, there were dozens more hidden in his remaining files, which aggressively attacked other systems and risked compromising Citadel's security altogether. Our cybersecurity forces have been working round the clock to try and mitigate the damage to other Spectre's information systems, as everything related to Saren has been quarantined until we can be sure there is nothing else lurking in the shadows. And they couldn't just admit this because... Oh right, politics. No wonder Spiritus had been so aggressive on the matter. And you only tell us this now? Do you realize how much time and energy was wasted? Udina's connection to the call suddenly dropped, and Admiral Singh didn't look the slightest bit guilty as his hand moved back from his control panel. Apologies, counselors, we seem to be having some communications difficulties. I am sure we can fill Ambassador Udina in on the details of the rest of the discussion separately. Now, Commander, I am sure your team wishes to rest after such a difficult mission. But if you can fill us in on the situation on the ground, as well as the broad details of the opposition faced, then my forces can take over the grunt work. Shepard smiled as she nodded in agreement, and now that Anderson was paying attention, the woman looked about as tired as he felt, the signs of combat clear on her armor in the form of dirt, scuff marks and blood. Thank you, Admiral. I am just connecting you to my most experienced operative on the ground. He has been coordinating the response in Scott, A/N, Terra Nova's capital city, and has more accurate numbers than I do. The space occupied by Ambassador Udina less than a minute ago was soon filled with the bulky figure of Shepard's Krogan, armor pitted with bullets scoring, blood still dripping from his mouth. And to Anderson's slight surprise, he felt that such a switch wasn't a bad thing. We're going to need every doc, nurse, or engineer that you have on your ships, and we need them yesterday. Someone said something from off-screen that Anderson didn't catch, but it seemed to be a criticism as Rex growled and tossed his head for a moment before continuing in his blunt manner. We don't have full counts, with all the people that were abducted or fled the city, but we are easily in the thousands of dead, and at least 30 times that somewhere between bleeding out slowly to walking wounded. The defense force for the capital has 17 combat-ready members left, and these are mostly medics and maintenance staff. There are no confirmed surviving combat team members as far as we can tell, though the old man should be confirming that with the survivors on his ship. Anderson wished he could say he was surprised or shocked, but the entire defense force for the planet had been about 5,000 people, and it was hardly like they had been expecting the attack. Most of the city center has been damaged in the fighting, especially with the strafing runs done by the Batarian transports as they flew in and out of the place. Personally, I think it adds character, but some of the structures are going to need tearing down and rebuilding, which would be no small cost. Though given the alternative of what would have happened if Shepard's team hadn't arrived, it would only be the bean counters on Earth that would be making those complaints, rather than anyone on or around the colony. There are still some raiders who didn't manage to evacuate before the rest of the cowards ran. I have the others organizing, tracking them down, and hemming them in. Anderson was slightly shocked that Rex wasn't out actively hunting the Batarian survivors himself, but given his blood-drenched armor, that was probably what he had been doing just before the call. We have almost 4,000 people aboard the Burning Leaf. Whilst most of them aren't injured beyond bumps and bruises, we'll be keeping them aboard until Rex is able to exert some level of control on the ground. Dropping a bunch of civilians into a still semi-active war zone is probably not a good idea. There are 3 sections of my ship that have been breached, 3 dead and 7 injured Marines, and a bunch of dead and captured Batarians that I want off my ship as fast as possible. With Uzumaki's interjection and the report on the Batarian ship, the rest of the reporting came thick and fast, Anderson's synapses firing just enough for him to take in the key details. Prisoner exchanges to the Council forces, securing of evidence, and how to manage the local populace were covered, as well as the search patterns that the Third Fleet would be using to try and catch the remaining Batarian ships before they could loop back to the mass relay. Given the ranged ships could initiate a mass relay jump, it would be impossible to block access to the relay completely, and playing defensively would just give the Batarians time to plan and coordinate their escape. I will head to this pinnacle station as soon as Admiral Singh formally takes control here, counselors. If we are going to become an official Spectre team, it is probably best we smash all the training you guys have set up. Anderson zoned back in as he heard Shepard discussing her plan, and noticed her sigh slightly before turning to Naruto. And I can't believe I am going to say this, but... Captain Naruto, what is your plan now? Naruto seemed to ponder things for a moment, before giving a massive grin. Well, Shepard Taishu, I think I have a few ideas. And at that point, Anderson decided he was going to stop listening altogether. And given the groan from the Council's communication terminal, he wasn't the only one that was terrified of Naruto's ideas. He could only hope that Naruto's plan involved going somewhere that wasn't the Citadel. Chapter 22, The Burning Leaf. The Burning Leaf, Citadel Mass Effect Relay, 7 o'clock May 4, 2184. Nirali Bhatia, Spectre Medical Assistant, Navy Corpsman. This is Captain Liavella of the Citadel Defense Fleet. Identify yourself and your ship at once. Stood on the bridge of their newly renamed ship, Nirali used the opportunity of the targeting alarms going off to cast a knowing look towards the commander's chair. No need for that, Nirali-chan. I suppose it was a little too much to hope the Council would let the Citadel Fleet know we were coming. Compared to his original lounging posture during the call with the Alliance group, Naruto was taking things far more seriously now, though that was at least partly because of the new crew he was in command of, in name if not function. Your orders, Captain? JV Carey was taking to her new role remarkably well, though she was still far too deferential in Nirali's opinion. There had been several questions raised amongst Commander Shepard's crew at Naruto's decision to choose her as his number 2, but Naruto waved them off in his typical genial manner without really answering any questions. Given most of the crew currently helping to man the bridge had first-hand experience of receiving the young man's somewhat selfless generosity, Nirali knew that none of them would be pushing the matter too hard in the near future. Patch me through, Carrie-san. We knew that dropping a Dreadnought-class ship into Citadel space was going to push some buttons. Might as well make my new position official. A new position that had involved a considerable change in costume for some reason, something that young Nora had taken a lot of joy in contributing suggestions towards. What resulted was a mixture of several stereotypes ranging from bounty hunter to space cowboy, though Nirali would be the first to admit that Naruto pulled off the long black trench coat, Stetson and double bandolier remarkably well. Now she just had to persuade him to lose the spurs off his shoes, the black bullwhip and fake lightsaber attached to his belt, and she might not feel too embarrassed to be seen with him in public. "This is Captain Naruto Uzumaki of the prize ship the Burning Leaf, on our way to the Citadel for repairs and refitting, as well as Alliance personnel for long-term medical treatment. There will be 4 frigates coming through in the next day or so, of Batarian origin, though the Council has taken control of them for the purpose of an official investigation." There was silence for a moment, before this Liavella spoke up once more, the earlier panic at least partially gone from her voice now. "Understood, Burning Leaf, you will be escorted to the coordinates we are sending you now. Be aware, we will be sending boarding parties to search your vessel, in line with recent updates to Council security measures. As you will be berthing on the Citadel directly, all weapons must be submitted for registration before arrival, and new regulations mean that only authorized personnel will be permitted to carry weapons above certain restrictions." Nirali wished she could feel surprised at the new security measures, but instead she felt a small degree of relief. It wouldn't be foolproof, especially as they could have only been implementing the new measures in the last day or so, but it showed that the Council were finally paying attention to the problems in their own back garden. "Thank you, Captain. We will send across the details of my crew shortly. Burning Leaf out." After JV Carey cut the communications link, Naruto stretched out all of his limbs like a cat that had been lounging in the sun too long. "Thanks, Carey-san. Make an official note or something. First thing we are changing is this chair." That comment brought several chuckles from the bridge crew, though Nirali knew there were a lot of other points that needed to be addressed before they looked at things like comfortable chairs. The bridge of the Burning Leaf was massive, easily 4 times larger than the Normandy's entire command deck, and this was mostly because of the Batarians' command system rather than out of any practical benefits. Where the Alliance would have at most 2 people for each ship function even for a ship this size, the Batarian ship had at least 5, with each control station limited to handling only small sections of the desired function. The Quarians from the Ontario had been able to patch the control systems sufficiently for them to be able to get the ship back to the Citadel, but with the limited number of competent crew members they had available, they would struggle to aim the ship's guns at a stationary target, let alone participate in actual combat. Personally, Nirali was wondering what Naruto had planned for the extra free space, which would become available when they ripped out the existing systems. But then again, given he had already turned several of the rooms on the lower decks into training rooms that seemed closer to the torture chambers they had been originally, she wasn't entirely sure she wanted to know. "Nirali-chan, have we got lists of all the low equipment that we brought on board? I imagine if we don't tell them we have enough arms and armor to outfit an entire mercenary company before they board, they will be a little twitchy." Naruto's question brought Nirali from her musing, and reminded her of the rather large promotion she had received upon joining Naruto on his new ship. "The final details are still being compiled by Zavina and AI, but we can send them across what we have now. We knew we would need them for your trip on the Citadel, and I wanted to have a full understanding of our other supplies before you go shopping." When she had turned in a full inventory of the Burning Leaf's medical supplies, as well as detailed lists of what they were missing, Naruto and the others all reacted with considerably more surprise and appreciation than she had expected. The fact that appreciation had led to her appointment as the ship's quartermaster, as well as the only medical professional aboard, was less appreciated than Naruto seemed to understand when he had offered it to her. If it weren't for the fact that Sage seemed to enjoy being the ship's sous chef, and had been more than happy to help her with the inventory, Nirali would probably have said no. Once they were settled, and she was less concerned about Naruto bankrupting himself with his latest business ventures, Nirali would enjoy discussing the pay rise she would be expecting if he wanted her to continue in both roles. Even if Naruto offered her less than the figure she had in her head, her dream of an earthen restaurant would be within her reach. "Fantastic, Nirali-chan! Carey-san, let's contact CSCC as well while we are waiting. Probably best to have the executor know we are coming with another batch of weapons. I'm sure Palin-san is looking forward to having me back on station. Seeing Naruto doing his best to maintain a serious expression on his face, as he uttered the greatest joke of the day in Nirali's humble opinion, broke the professional barrier she had been keeping up all morning. Given Mari, Alina and even little Nora joined in with her laughter, Nirali didn't feel even slightly guilty as Naruto pouted a little. The ninja-turned-ship captain seemed to realize they weren't going to finish laughing at him for some time, as he proceeded to ignore them and start talking to the clearly confused JV Carry. "No respect, Carry-san, nothing. Get me that line to CCC and then gather a security team. I have some investments to check in on." And all of a sudden, Nirali's humor dampened considerably. Why did she get the feeling that the shipyard he had bought weren't the only thing he was referring to? Shinobi Shipbuilding Company Hangar 1, Citadel, 1400 hours May 5, 2184. Liavale Nar Oni, Quarian Pilgrim, 2nd year. You too, when you have finished replacing that armor plating, get down to the main platform right away. You are wanted there for some reason. Doing her best to focus on the welding work she was doing, Liavale felt her stomach drop at the human's words. Their crew boss, a rather angry human by the name of Gareth, or something like that, would only be allowing them to stop working mid-shift if his boss had told him to do so. And as Aquarian, being forced to see the upper management usually only meant one thing. Why? Her shift mate, Aquarian who had only started his pilgrimage 4 months before, was considerably more vocal than she felt comfortable with being. Thankfully, Gareth seemed content to ignore the question as he stamped off back down the gantry. No doubt there were other workers to terrorize. With no one else to complain to, and seemingly still naive about how life on the Citadel worked, her shift mate turned back to her. "We haven't missed a shift, get paid considerably less than those experienced human crews that are always losing valuable parts." The anger in his voice was matched by the feeling in Liavale's stomach, but in all honesty she had been expecting this since the change in ownership of the shipyard had been made known to them. Not that the dozens of new people, varying from smartly clad humans to a few Quarians like herself, in the previous weeks had been exactly subtle. And if there was one thing Liavale knew well, the first thing a new owner would be doing is streamlining their business. Efficiency cuts, always easier to lose day-to-day workers first, rather than the contracted workers who can demand severance money. That was the excuse Liavale had received previously, when her previous employers had been bothered to justify kicking her out rather than just telling her she wasn't getting paid. Finishing the last section of welding required for this plate, Liavale put down the welding torch and lifted the personalized welding mask made to fit to Aquarian's mask. She would leave it nearby. The last thing she needed was being arrested for attempted theft again on top of losing what had been a steady job by Quarian standards. Whilst she didn't have the foolishness to think that every crime leveled at Aquarian was without merit, some of the most sophisticated crime gangs on the Citadel were Quarian after all, Liavale was very much reaching the end of her mouth filter in terms of patience. Maneuvering their work platform back up to the gantry way, Liavale was now glad she had ensured that she kept nothing she couldn't live without in her locker, as she could see other crews moving back in the same direction. In fact, as she gave a second look over the hangar, it looked like everyone had been called over. Pessimism warred with her battered and bruised optimism for a moment, as she tried to convince herself that this wasn't what she had originally thought. She nearly succeeded, until they reached the stairs leading down the main hangar floor, and saw more than 20 Batarians stood covering the exits from the hangar, whilst half a dozen CCC operatives stood with a young man she recognized as the new owner of the shipyard. Rather than the very smart suit that he had been dressed in when he had made the tour of their facility, he was now dressed in combat armor and touting weapons to boot, which very much changed the perception of him Liavale had first formed. She had thought him a spoilt child, obviously born into money if he could afford to buy out some of the galaxy's most expensive real estate in a single swoop. Now though, clad in light combat armor and looking down with a blank mask impression on his face, Liavale got the feeling she had gotten the wrong impression of her new boss. And judging by the fact that every member of the shipyard's management team was stood amongst the crowd of workers, she hadn't been the only one. Reaching the edge of the crowd, slipping past the small groups of humans and other council races to stand with the group of Quarians towards the front of the still-growing mass. Not because they wanted to be at the front, Leavale thought bitterly even as one of the other Quarians beckoned them over with a muted wave that fitted the mood a little too well. "You've missed quite a bit already." The excited tone in the old Quarian's voice, a permanent Citadel Quarian that decided for whatever twisted reasoning that life on the Citadel was better than it was in the migrant fleet, surprised her enough for it to show in her body language. "You know the operations director, Benoit?" Leavale did know the name, though thankfully had never met the human who had been in charge of the dockyard on behalf of the company who owned it, so nodded her head after scanning the hangar and not being able to make him out. "New boss shows up with all these CCC goons following him, just as Benoit is finishing his monthly report meeting, otherwise known as checking the figures and working out how they could hide the unofficial work they did on some of the ships that came through the shipyard, and therefore pocket the proceeds." If any of the management thought they were being subtle, Leavale worried for their mental aptitude. "Benoit comes storming down to try and head them off before they can see anything they shouldn't, and barely gets a sentence in before they grab him and cuff him, right in front of everyone." That was a surprising twist. Looking closer at the group of executives and other higher management people in the front of the crowd, Leavale now noted that there were a couple of others missing that she knew held important positions. But before she could think things through any further, the reason all of her colleagues were gathered spoke up. "Now that you're all here, or at least nearly all of you, allow me to introduce myself." Leavale doubted anyone really needed to be reminded who he was, but she had to admit he was good at grabbing everyone's attention. "I am Naruto Uzumaki, founder of Shinobi Shipbuilding and new owner of this dockyard. That makes me your new boss, and I want nothing more than to support those that have put their blood and sweat into running this place." He smiled at this point, a smile that probably looked warm and friendly to most people. But Quarians looked to body language rather than facial expressions, and Leavale's reading was that of a Varan, looking down on a drunken Volus and waiting for the right moment to strike. "So I looked into your contracts, and I feel that your previous employer had been very harsh to most of you regarding salary increases and overtime pay. Barring a few known friends of Mr. Benoit, in fact, it's noted that none of you received the last 3 quarterly bonuses, despite the fact the credits were allocated as such." That got angry mumbling from nearly all of the contracted workers at this point, and despite the fact his body language hadn't changed in the slightest, this Mr. Uzumaki was proving he knew exactly how to handle a crowd. "Not to worry though, my legal team have prepared new contracts for all loyal employees that have much greater benefits included, and those bonuses will be back paid in full." He paused, as there were noises of celebration and joy, even amongst some of the younger Quarians who were clearly not paying enough attention. When Mr. Uzumaki continued though, his smile now matched his body language, all teeth and cold humor. "Once of course, the required tests, interviews and reviews have been carried out." It was like someone had vented the entire room, the only noise the slight laughter of the young Asari, stood next to what she assumed was the girl's mother, and recording this? "You see, with the misappropriation of funds by the management of this dockyard, there is already a black mark that could be placed on my company's image, which in turn would reflect badly on you all. So for the last 3 weeks I have had some external contractors looking at various aspects, both commercial and personnel related." It was very tempting for Leavale to turn and look at the non-Quarians now stood silently behind them, as a faint glimmer of hope and satisfaction settled in her stomach. But she didn't dare take her eyes off her new boss in case he dropped the other EMP on her next. "I haven't looked through the reports in great detail yet, I am a very busy man after all, but I know there are some employees who have been taking advantage of the lax management here. Being the generous man I am, I don't want to punish those who were perhaps led astray by those above them. So before I ask these officers to act on the information I have about various charges that could be raised, I thought I would give anyone who feels this might apply to them the chance a simple way out." Mr. Uzumaki gestured off to his right, where 3 Turians were stood with data slates. "Anyone who decides to terminate their employment here in the next 5 minutes will be able to leave without any risk of punishment. A clean slate and a positive reference for their next position elsewhere. Anyone who obviously doesn't have anything to hide, so will be able to take the new proposed contracts and review them for tomorrow." It was a bluff, or at least that is what Leavale assumed, but it was quite a clever one. Mr. Uzumaki had already revealed that he had uncovered Director Benoit as a criminal, and that would no doubt be in everyone's minds as the metaphorical clock began to tick down. You're bluffing. Trying to strong-arm us into signing less favorable contracts to save a few credits. This came from a Turian that Liavale vaguely remembered was the Citadel Union of Workers representative amongst the group. There were several mutinous mutterings of agreement from different groups at this, though Mr. Uzumaki didn't seem too worried as he flicked through data on his Omni tool, before stopping and looking up. Of course not, Mr. C.S. Kwanian? Once you have had a chance to read the contract, you will see that the average pay of workers at this dockyard will go up almost 10%. Though, as you are one of the few to continue receiving his bonuses and pay increases, I don't think you will see such an increase in your wages. Especially when the extra union membership fees that you have been taking from your fellow workers are returned to their rightful owners. The mutterings were now considerably louder, most of them now directed at CS rather than Mr. Uzumaki. The Turian stuck between outraged and horrified as Liavale turned and eyed the crowd. Whilst Mr. Uzumaki's hard approach was definitely going to get rid of the worst elements in the dockyard, depending on who managed to hold their nerve, she had no illusions that he even needed anything close to this level of theatrics to deal with her and her fellow Quarians. 4 minutes, ladies and gentlemen. The revelation of Sia's misdeeds seemed to have been the final piece of dirt to block the air filter, as one of the younger mechanics moved towards the stage, ignoring several whispered threats and warnings from his colleagues. Then there was a slow trickle of people from throughout the crowd, though by the end of the 5 minutes at least half of the contracted workforce had stepped forwards and left the hall. Only 2 Quarians had left, though there were several who were clearly tempted. Interesting. Mr. Uzumaki looked at his Omni tool again, before waving to one of the CCC officers. All yours, Gibbs! The grizzled-looking Turian seemed to bristle at the familiar address before he shook it off and took center stage. All those on the following list are to consider themselves under arrest for various crimes, which will be detailed in the warrants you and your attorney will be reading during the initial interviews. If you don't have an attorney will. Chaos exploded around Liavale as it seemed to dawn on everyone that their new boss hadn't been bluffing at all. That meant he had probably investigated every single one of them before this showpiece, and that many private investigators would cost more than the shipyard would make in profit for the next quarter. Just who in Nikila's name was this human? Captain's Quarters, the Normandy, Pinnacle 1710 May 7, 2184. Jane Shepard, Council Spectre. It had been 2 days of written testing and presentations, during which she had to stop Rex from murdering their teachers at least twice. Personally, Jane was most annoyed when the commander of the station himself had presented a battlefield representation of her desperate defense of Elysium during the Skillian Blitz, Commander Ahern trying to pick apart every decision she and her fellow Marines made during the defense. So when the opportunity to cut loose came earlier this afternoon, with the beginning of the scored training simulations, pretty much her entire team had been prepared to inflict more than a little violence. They had smashed the record on the first mission so comprehensively that the station commander had actually questioned her about potential pre-mission intelligence gathering. The accusation of cheating didn't even upset her, that much at least, though he was clearly upset when she laughed in his face. She and her team had been involved in more combat in the last few months than most serving military personnel saw in a lifetime, and the enemies they were facing were pathetic in comparison. The simulated Geth were so poorly programmed it actually had thrown them off at first, with the Geth not using cover effectively or even acting as a united enemy force, though Jane supposed that there was a lack of available data outside of the Normandy's crew more than anything else. They'd been holding on to all combat data and their tactics since the fight on Pharos, mostly because she didn't trust the Council not to leak it to Saren, and the Alliance not to leak it to Cerberus. But given she was currently staring at the holographic representation of the elusive man, through the intermediary of Naruto's news ship and its communication systems, Jane wasn't entirely sure where the Cerberus threat was most prominent now. Commander, when Captain Uzumaki informed me that you would be joining this conversation, I must admit I was more than a little surprised. Despite his words, the elusive man's tone and posture showed no such surprise, and Jane wouldn't be shocked if he had expected her last-minute decision to be involved in the conversation. Just because I don't trust you doesn't mean I won't listen to what you have to tell us. Your information on my sister was correct, and even the ambush led to us rescuing a human colony, so I won't risk missing out on further opportunities because of my desire to mount you on a stake ass first. To his credit, the elusive man did look at least somewhat apologetic at the mention of the Batarian attack. I can only hold my hands up and admit it was a mistake by our internal security, and my own error for missing the traitor in Sybaris' midst. The information we have obtained about the origins of the payments to my former agent will be with you by the end of the day, as I am sure you will want to deal with the Batarian pirates behind it yourself. Both of them paused, looking towards the currently silent third member of this little chinwag. Naruto didn't even seem to notice, working through various forms and documentation on his desk that Shepard assumed were part and parcel of his new role. Seeing as her resident ninja wasn't going to interject, though she had no doubt he was listening in, Jane decided to carry the conversation forward. That information will be appreciated. It physically hurt her a little when she said that, but she managed to keep it from being audible in her tone. No need for pretenses, Commander. I prefer people to be honest, even if it is in their anger and dislike of my operation. Contrary to popular belief, I am not one for politicking if it can be avoided. Despite the offer to be honest with her feelings, Jane didn't entirely relax. This was still a potential enemy she was talking to after all. So no more attempts to infiltrate the Normandy? As much as Kasumi was of assistance in saving Terra Nova, the next person that tries something like that will be dealt with rather more abruptly. Especially as Naruto wasn't around to prevent her dealing with such attempts in a more permanent fashion now. No need. I got all the information I needed from your response to the infiltration, though I think Agent Lawson will take some time to recover from the slight. She can hold something of a grudge, I'm afraid. Jane let out a small laugh, pleased to have annoyed someone at Sybaris, though a deadpan comment from the new ship captain stopped her from responding directly. So the 4 human applicants I have received CVs for that are obviously spies, aren't yours, Gigi? Good to know. There wasn't even the slightest of twitches from the elusive man, but it was clear to everyone present that Naruto had just scored a point in whatever game the two of them were playing. I may have mentioned to the units I have operating on the Citadel to provide an applicant to test your screening protocols, Mr. Uzumaki, though I had assumed they would coordinate to only send a single candidate. I suppose it wouldn't help if I promised that they have all been instructed to aid you and Commander Shepard in any way they can? Naruto seemed to consider it for a second before smiling and wagging a finger in the elusive man's direction. So there is at least one that I missed? If you wanted to provide me with a more direct contact, Gigi, you should have just asked. I don't suppose Pretty-chan is available? The question about this Agent Lawson caught Jane off guard, and given the raised eyebrow from the elusive man, she wasn't the only one. Agent Lawson is one of my top agents, and manages many of my field teams that don't require my direct oversight. I would immediately say no, but you have me intrigued as to the reasoning behind your request. The elusive man wasn't the only one, and if this wasn't just a new strategy by Naruto to throw his opponent off track, they would be having words. She can think for herself. Naruto seemed to think such a short explanation was sufficient, going back to his paperwork. Naruto. Jane managed to keep the majority of her annoyance out of her tone as she grabbed his attention once more and waiting until he looked up with genuine confusion on his face to gesture that he needed to explain further. What? I don't want someone who has to go back to Gigi every time I want information or their thoughts on what we do next. No offense, Gigi, but from what I have seen of most of your people so far, zealot is the word I would use. And not in the good way. Given how she snapped at you after you rescued her, she isn't afraid to tell her superiors when she disagrees with them. But at the same time, she is clearly loyal to your cause, can plan and execute missions without direct oversight, and I assume she is combat capable given she was in the field in the first place. There was a moment of silence, as Jane tried to understand Naruto's logic. She was also doing her best to ignore the darker part of her mind, that was trying to find fault in his reasoning for having another woman under his command aboard his ship. Interesting analysis, Lieutenant. I suppose it's Captain now, actually. And here I thought you might be asking for me as a contact merely because you found me attractive. The arrival of a fourth member to their conversation should have been an unpleasant surprise to Jane, but she supposed it actually helped prove Naruto's point. As this Agent Lawson stepped into view through the elusive man's communication device, Jane felt the stab of hate that most women felt when they saw what they thought was a more attractive woman step into their space. Dressed now in military-style fatigues, rather than the casual business wear she had been wearing on the Citadel to blend in, the woman managed to look more attractive despite the clear attempt to not flaunt her body. "Mr. Uzumaki, Commander Shepard, I know you have already met. But allow me to introduce you to Miranda Lawson, one of my top operatives." The elusive man seemed to have conceded Naruto's point about Lawson, the man stepping back literally as well as figuratively in the conversation. "I still prefer Pretty-chan." Naruto trailed off, as Miranda's professional mask morphed into a cold glare that even Jane was slightly impressed by, the young ninja holding up his hands in a clear sign of surrender. "But I suppose we are being professional here. Sorry, Miranda-san, you are very beautiful and would definitely be more fun to contact than Gigi. But have you seen who I work with every day?" Naruto made no indication of who he meant with that backhanded compliment, but Jane allowed a self-satisfied smirk to show as Miranda's eyes darted her way for a second. "Who you work with is precisely my concern. A female Batarian first officer, Ms. Goto as your counterintelligence officer, Corpsman Badia as your medical officer, 3 Asari including 2 who seem to have past ties to Saren or other anti-human efforts. There seems to be a single underlying theme to your recruitment efforts, or am I to be convinced it's all just one big coincidence?" To his credit, Naruto looked genuinely confused at what Miranda was getting at for a moment, before his face suddenly reddened slightly, and he reached up to scratch the back of his head. "You wouldn't believe me if I said I never thought of it like that till now?" "Thought not. Blame Jane-chan, she's the one that decided she was keeping Rex and Gurus on the Normandy. And in regards to picking a contact for Cerberus, it's a choice between you and the samurai wannabe at the moment, so, no contest?" The attempt to shift the blame onto her wasn't entirely fair, though given the crew of the Ontario were almost 70% female. Perhaps she had her own hiring bias to think about. Miranda continued to stare coldly at Naruto for several moments before she nodded slowly, the smallest of smiles on her face for a second before it was flattened into her seemingly default serious mask. "It's not like I will ever step on your ship, so even if you are trying to build your own little pleasure boat harem, I won't have to deal with you in person." As Naruto descended into a bunch of rapid and rushed denials, that Jane got the feeling were at least a little exaggerated, the elusive man decided to bring the conversation back on point. "Well, now that the two of you are on more agreeable terms, we can work out the details of the first point of contact later. I know that Commander Shepard has a busy schedule for the next 2 weeks, so I imagine it will be Mr. Uzumaki and his new team that will be actioning this information." Miranda nodded at the subtle reminder, before turning to face Jane fully for the first time in this conversation. "We have intel on the Geth setting up outposts on at least half a dozen worlds in the Scythian Verge. The reasons for these bases are unknown, but given the increase of Geth attacks on shipping and small outposts in the region, they probably serve as resupply points and relay bases." Miranda pressed some keys on her Omni tool, and the image of the 2 Cerberus members was replaced with the galactic map. "Our scout ships have confirmed 2 of the base locations in the Armstrong Nebula. The other locations are merely the systems that have been identified with increased Geth activity." Jane looked at the highlighted locations, a small frown forming as she tried to work out what purpose these Geth would have in Saren's grand plan. If it were to do with the Reapers, such as excavating another Prothean artifact or obtaining another Prothean expert like Liera, the Geth would be concentrated on a single system, 2 at most if there was some uncertainty over the location. Spoiling attacks, trying to divert attention and resources from other sectors. At best this is a secondary objective for him, probably trying to force the Alliance Navy to spread their forces as thinly as possible before his actual attacks, wherever/whatever that will be. There was no comment from the others, meaning they most likely agreed. "So the question is, Commander, what is Saren doing if this isn't his actual objective? Given all of Saren's official resources have been frozen by the Council, it's not as if there is much of a paper trail we can follow to find where he is holed up." The elusive man seemed to be happy to take a more back-seat approach for this conversation now, Miranda's tone lightening slightly as she responded. "If you can find out what these people were doing, and how they were paid and who, then we might have some leads to follow." It took Naruto several moments, which took away some of the impressiveness of his immediate solution to their dead end, before quite literally dozens of faces appeared on the screen. It took a moment, given that some of the photos were somewhat blurry, before Jane started recognizing some of the pictures. There were some of the people who had attacked them on the Citadel at various points, but there were also what looked like pictures from people's social media profiles or professional work profiles. I assume there is some link between these people and Saren? To Jane's surprise, there wasn't any level of distrust or disbelief in Miranda's voice at Naruto's revelation. I'm not sure they directly linked to Saren team, but they either tried to kill us, spy on us, report everything we do, or a combination of all three. I have Kasumi-chan and my contacts following up, but some support in accessing their electronic history would be very useful. Jane was looking at the photos that were clearly taken in public, usually in crowds that were probably following members of the team. There was something that was picking at her, and she couldn't work out. There! The fact her exclamation was copied almost perfectly by Miranda in timing was more than slightly irritating, but the fact she had caught something Naruto had missed was more than enough to make up for it. Not the same Asari in every picture, but the same one appears at least 3 times in your photos. Highlighting the images she meant, Jane saw that Miranda was highlighting different pictures, though the Cerberus woman waited until Jane had finished speaking before adding her own comments. These Asari are all dressed in exactly the same clothes, all 2 seasons behind the latest fashion trends and clearly not form-fitting. Bought in bulk and used to help them blend in with the crowds, standard Asari commando tactics. Jane couldn't help but quirk an eyebrow at Miranda's knowledge of fashion trends, a sign of normalcy that she didn't believe Cerberus agents were capable of. Really? I just thought that was an Asari culture thing. Naruto didn't look too embarrassed at the oversight he had been caught in, though Jane got the feeling that the ninja would be kicking himself for the assumption he had made later. It doesn't matter, Naruto. The fact you got all of these images is what gave us this lead. Jane wouldn't admit it out loud, but the beaming smile Naruto threw in her direction at her reassurance gave her a warm feeling in her stomach for a moment. Before the embarrassment at having such a feeling about someone almost a decade younger than her kicked in. Well, we know that Saren has at least one accomplice who is an Asari matriarch. I will have my teams look into tracking these commandos, if you can do some digging on the Citadel to determine where they might be based. Naruto started nodding, but then paused and looked in Jane's direction. Whilst they had discussed the fact that him taking command of the Burning Leaf meant he wasn't going to be under her command structure anymore, it was nice that he still wanted her opinion before agreeing anything. Especially as this was the group that Jane had considered in the top 5 on her shit list only weeks before. Talk to Shirala and Mari, Naruto. Since both of them worked for Matriarch Benizia, they will have knowledge of who these people are and what their tactics might be. I am sure they will have your new business under observation now, so you and Kasumi should be able to do some counter-shadowing without arousing too much in the way of suspicion. It went unsaid that the 2 of them would only be seen if they wanted to be. Got it, Jane-chan. Once I am doing with some business matters, I will get to work on these guys. Should have something by the end of the week. Anything else pretty ch? Miranda-san? Despite changing his form of address partway through, Naruto looked a lot less intimidated by Miranda's glare at his nickname for her this time, his cheery smile not diminishing in the slightest. Nothing of immediate concern. I am sure that I will be in contact with you soon, Captain Uzumaki. The sigh that Miranda failed to repress entirely made Jane smirk, even after the 4 of them finished the call, and she was left alone with her thoughts. Whilst Naruto unleashing his brand of annoying on Cerberus isn't exactly what she had planned for her long-planned revenge. It would do as a starting point,